Build 2020, a people's history of the future. The Manifesto.
As a result of the 60s and 70s, minority groups earned new rights. They never should have been denied these rights in the first place. But today's youth need to understand that these rights were not granted to them. They were not given to them. People stood up for themselves and fought tirelessly for these rights. This is the story of human history. Monarchies and governments have never given people anything that they didn't stand up and demand for themselves. Civil rights laws were passed in the 1960s that secured many people's right to vote for the first time. Slavery didn't end in 1865. Slave conditions persisted well into the 1900s, along with lynchings of blacks in the South, and likewise, countless lynchings of Mexicans in Texas. During the 60s and 70s, women and people of color gained increased access to social, cultural, and political institutions. Social programs were created to help struggling segments of the population. Desegregation and affirmative action programs were created in an effort to level the playing field. A radical revolutionary agenda was pushed by some leftist groups, and there were elements of socialism and communism at work in the civil rights agenda. But the civil rights movement at large was not a socialist or communist movement. Opponents of civil rights have successfully framed the civil rights movement as a radical communist movement, and they have used this as a tool. Conversely, students of history understand that the counter-revolution has proven to be much more radical in its theft of public wealth and its deprivation of people's basic needs. The civil rights movement was a diverse and somewhat loosely connected movement, from the truly revolutionary Black Panther Party to groups of fairly conservative white feminists who simply wanted more opportunities to climb the social and corporate capitalist ladder. The victories of the civil rights movement did not move the U.S. towards a socialist economy. The United States operated more as a mixed market economy during the New Deal era, but the U.S. has never been close to true socialism. The fact is that the actual laws and policies that arose out of the civil rights struggle were fairly conservative. They guaranteed basic rights, which have been slowly but methodically chipped away since the time they were passed. The greatest legacy of the civil rights movement is that activist traditions were set, and they inspired people. Some people have been duped into believing that the movement ended, which is false. It just changed shape and form, and branched out into smaller issue-specific movements. As governments around the world have done less and less for their citizens, people have stepped up in increasingly large numbers, working on issues of land, bread, food, clothes, shelter, and everything in between. The civil rights movement did not turn a racist, hierarchical, discriminatory society completely on its head. It did plant seeds for future efforts to organize for racial, cultural, political, social, and gender equality. This movement inspired activism, violence, and response. Beyond the infiltration of civil rights organizations and the assassination of leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., JFK, and Malcolm X, a counter-revolution was planned in corporate boardrooms and think tanks. The 1980s ushered in the era of trickle-down economics, or Reaganomics. This is the idea that if you cut taxes for the rich, they will keep more of their money, invest more money into their businesses, spend more money, and therefore create more jobs. According to this theory, their wealth trickles down to the entire population, producing boundless wealth for the entire society. Anybody paying attention understands clearly that trickle-down economics was never intended to increase wealth for everyone. This economic agenda, which has remained dominant for over 30 years, was never about wealth trickling down. Instead, it was about dissolving public wealth and funneling it up the chain to the most privileged members of society. This economic model of Reaganomics is also referred to as supply-side economics, or free market capitalism. It is known as neoliberalism in Latin America and neoconservatism in the United States. These varying definitions confuse people, but this dominant global economic model relies on fairly simple principles. major tax cuts for the wealthy, the dissolution of social programs, deregulation of business so that there are no standards or rules, no corporate responsibility to citizens. Lastly, the goal is privatization of government resources and public space. Basically, this all translates to the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. The counter-revolutionaries have been successful at redistributing wealth to the rich because they took control of the bait. They utilized resources in media, business, and technology that the bottom-up activists didn't have access to. They shaped the culture war by playing off fears of communism and socialism, and they used racism, sexism, classism, and homophobia to divide the citizenry. The counter-revolution made the economic culture war about small business versus fear of big government. The rhetoric of support for small businesses has never matched the reality of the corporate agenda. Do your research and consider skyrocketing corporate profit margins between 1980 and 2010. Compare that with very little change in the minimum wage over 30 years, and the number of decent paying jobs that have been lost in America so that profit margins could quadruple through third world sweatshop labor. What young people need to understand about the argument between government and private sector control is this. When wealth is controlled by the government, it is ultimately controlled by the people. Governments will always misuse power and resources. But that was what the Constitution and the three branches of government were for. Before being hijacked by corporate business, the setup of the US government, despite its many flaws, was designed to protect the citizenry. When the government oversees some of society's wealth, that means that the people own that wealth via the government. At least in theory, the government has the responsibility to protect the citizenry and their wealth. If a government becomes tyrannical, revolution is an option in order to restore order and return wealth back to the people. In the case of privatization, who controls the wealth? Who owns that wealth? The answer, only those who control it. They're responsible to their shareholders. Private owners of wealth have absolutely no responsibility to you nor anyone else, not in theory nor in practice. This analysis is not a vote for socialism, nor is it a denunciation of capitalism as a whole. This is an expose on reality. The decades of the 1980s, the 90s, and 2000 have been about mass redistribution of wealth, but not in the direction that many people fear. From the mid-70s forward, the counter-revolutionaries have sought to brand any program that seeks to make people's lives better as socialist or communist or as a government handout. Making people's lives better is about resources. For people's lives to improve in general, it is a logical fact that someone has to give up some of their wealth. The extent to which this should happen is a question for all citizens in a democratic society. The old standard, the oversimplified dichotomy of capitalism versus socialism, is no longer relevant. What is the difference between communism and capitalism when the overwhelming majority of the wealth is concentrated in the hands of an elite few? Clearly, a new paradigm in economic discourse is needed. An honest conversation is necessary, but this will not happen without a well-informed population. Many people will tell you that there's no time to stay informed. They're too busy hustling and surviving to keep up with what's going on, especially as things change so quickly. Meanwhile, potential improvements to public education, healthcare, childcare services, and other social programs are routinely defeated under the rallying cry of government handouts. Over 30 years, massive amounts of public wealth were privatized and transferred to corporate hands. Much of the American military has been transformed into private industry. Many of the functions of American government have been outsourced to private contractors. More and more of the prisons that are built in the US and abroad are privately owned and operated. The corporate contractors of these prisons contract out cheap prison labor to other corporations that produce many goods that are no longer produced in US factories, including military supplies. The American taxpayer pays the bill for America's wars and its prisons, while corporate industry owners make enormous profits off these institutions. What becomes of a society in which the incentives for death and destruction outweigh the benefits of peace? Naomi Klein argues in her book, The Shock Doctrine, that in fact a new paradigm has emerged. She calls it the disaster capitalism complex. War, prison, and environmental catastrophe have become extremely profitable in this new us versus them paradigm that leaves the overwhelming majority of human beings on the losing end of the spectrum. The American lifestyle is becoming more tracked into a corporate, consumerist paradigm, even as the average consumer finds him or herself with less and less money to buy all the glittery, third-world-made products on department store shelves. In a 2010 editorial by Ariana Huffington, titled "Life in the Age of Much Worse Than We Thought It Would Be," the Huffington Post puts America's economic future in perspective. It is projected that interest on the debt in America alone will reach $900 billion by the year 2020. That same year, 5 segments of government spending, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, net interest and defense spending, will account for an estimated 77% of all government expenditures. All other federal spending will have to come out of the remaining 23%. This will leave very little money to put towards the legitimate needs of poor, working, and middle-class people who have paid into the tax system their entire lives. These are the intended results of the counter-revolution. The program is big business, big money, and corporate expansion. The natural health of human beings and their environment is simply not part of this equation.